3 months. For 3 months, Alessandro watched her collapse in slow motion, her body giving out one piece at a time, until that Thursday afternoon, when she finally hit the marble floor of his office, and his entire world stopped. The sound of her fall, the way her files scattered like snow across the polished stone, the absolute stillness of her body. It broke something in him that no amount of money or power could ever fix. And when he lifted her unconscious form into his arms, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile, Alessandro Vittorio realized that the iron control he'd maintained for 35 years had shattered completely, because somewhere between her first day at Vittorio Enterprises and this terrifying moment, his secretary had become the only thing in his empire that actually mattered. If you want to discover how a job interview in a towering Manhattan skyscraper transformed a struggling student and a ruthless billionaire into two souls who couldn't survive without each other, subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like if you believe that sometimes love finds us in our most vulnerable moments. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your presence here makes all the difference. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 93 days. Elena Martinez arrived at Vittorio Enterprises at exactly 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her official start time, carrying the same worn leather bag that had seen her through 4 years of night classes at community college and 2 years of unemployment before that. She took the service elevator to avoid the executives who started trickling in around 7, changed from her sneakers into the black heels she kept in her desk drawer, and had Alessandro's first espresso ready at precisely 7:00 a.m. when he strode through the frosted glass doors of the executive. Sweet. Alessandro Vittorio was a man who made grown investors weep and competitors flee the market with a single phone call. At 35, he'd built a commercial real estate empire that owned half of Manhattan's skyline and had expansion projects in 15 countries. He had his grandfather's ruthless business instinct, his father's cold precision, and absolutely no patience for incompetence, weakness, or the messy complications of human emotion. His previous 7 secretaries had each lasted less than 2 months before his exacting standards and brutal honesty sent them fleeing to less demanding positions. But Elena was different. From that first interview 3 months ago, when she'd walked into his office with a resume that showed more gaps than employment, wearing a suit from a department store clearance rack, and looked him directly in those ice-blue eyes without flinching, Alessandro had known she possessed something his other secretaries lacked. Desperation, yes. She needed this job with an intensity that radiated from her like heat, but also dignity. Pride. A steel spine hidden beneath that bargain suit, and those careful, professional smiles. She was 24 years old, worked his demanding schedule without complaint, never made the same mistake twice, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his needs before he articulated them. She was also slowly killing herself, and Alessandro had watched it happen day by day with a growing unease he refused to name. It started with small things. The coffee she made for him was always perfect, but he never saw her drink any herself. She brought him lunch from the Italian deli he preferred, but her own desk held only an apple or a granola bar that often sat untouched until evening. When he worked late, which was most nights, she stayed late too, her fingers flying across the keyboard with desperate efficiency even as exhaustion painted dark shadows beneath her brown eyes. "You can go home," he'd tell her at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., sometimes midnight. "I'll finish this myself." But she never left before he did, as if some unspoken rule governed her commitment to this position. And Alessandro, who prided himself on not caring about the personal lives of his employees, found himself noticing things. The way she'd started wearing the same rotation of 3 blouses. The way she'd stopped taking lunch breaks entirely. The way her cheekbones had become more pronounced, her wrists more delicate, as if she were slowly disappearing. "Elena," he'd said one evening about 6 weeks into her employment, looking up from a contract to find her swaying slightly at her desk. "When did you last eat?" She'd blinked at him with those huge dark eyes, confusion flickering across her face as if the question was in a foreign language. "I had breakfast, Mr. Vittorio. What did you have?" "Coffee." "Coffee isn't breakfast. It is when you're running late," she'd replied with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then returned to typing the correspondence he'd dictated an hour earlier. He should have pushed then. Should have demanded answers. Should have done something other than return to his contract with a strange tightness in his chest that he attributed to the espresso. But Alessandro Vittorio didn't involve himself in employees' personal problems. He paid excellent salaries, offered comprehensive benefits, and expected people to manage their own lives. If Elena was struggling, that was her concern, not his. Except, he couldn't stop noticing the way she'd started arriving earlier, staying later, as if afraid that any reduction in her visible dedication would cost her this position. The way her hands trembled slightly when she poured his afternoon coffee. The way she'd begun sitting very still at her desk during brief moments of quiet, as if movement required too much energy. "You're working her too hard," his brother Marco had commented during a rare visit to the office. "Your secretary looks like she hasn't slept in a week." "She manages her own schedule," Alessandro had replied coldly. "Besides, she's never complained. That's because she's terrified of losing this job," Marco said, studying Elena through the glass partition with the same analytical gaze that made him successful in international negotiations. "Look at her, Ale. Really look. That woman is running on fumes." But Alessandro hadn't looked. Not really. Because looking would mean acknowledging the strange protective instinct that flared in his chest whenever Elena pushed herself too hard. Looking would mean admitting that somewhere in the monotonous routine of meetings and contracts and empire building, his perfect, efficient, slowly vanishing secretary had become important to him in a way that had nothing to do with her professional capabilities. So he'd buried himself deeper in work, demanded more, pushed harder, while Elena met every impossible standard with that quiet dignity that both impressed and worried him. 3 months. 93 days of watching her sacrifice herself on the altar of this job, of pretending he didn't care, of maintaining the cold professional distance that had always served him so well, until that Thursday afternoon when distance became impossible and pretending became a luxury he could no longer afford. The morning of the collapse had started with a crisis. Their largest investor, a Saudi prince with controlling interest in 3 of their most profitable projects, had threatened to pull out due to rumors of financial instability. Rumors that were completely unfounded, but incredibly damaging. Alessandro had spent from 7 a.m. until noon in back-to-back calls, his temper growing shorter with each minute, his demands on Elena increasing proportionally. She'd arranged emergency conference calls with Tokyo, London, and Dubai. She'd pulled 5 years of financial records in under an hour. She'd coordinated with their PR team, legal department, and the CFO's office simultaneously, while still managing Alessandro's regular impossible schedule. He'd seen her take exactly 1 break, a 3-minute trip to the restroom at 10 a.m., during which she'd actually run both directions based on how quickly she returned. "Mr. Vittorio, the prince is on line 3, she'd said at 11:47. Her voice perfectly controlled despite the slight pallor of her skin. "I have the Nakamura contracts ready for your 1 p.m. The revised Patterson proposal is on your desk, and I've rescheduled your 2:30 with Senator Williams to tomorrow morning at 8. "Good," he'd said without looking up, already reaching for line 3. "Hold all other calls." She'd nodded and retreated to her desk, where through the glass partition he could see her immediately pick up her headset to manage the 17 other fires burning simultaneously across his empire. The call with the prince lasted 90 minutes and required every ounce of Alessandro's considerable charm and strategic thinking. By the time he'd smoothed the ruffled feathers and secured the investor's continued commitment, it was past 1 p.m. and his next meeting was already waiting. "Elena, get me," he'd started to say, emerging from his office, but stopped when he actually looked at her. She was standing at her desk, one hand gripping the edge for support, her face the color of chalk. As he watched, she swayed, caught herself, and took a breath so deep and deliberate it was clearly meant to fight off dizziness. "Elena." His voice came out sharper than intended. "Sit down." "I'm fine, Mr. Vittorio," she said, straightening with visible effort. "The Nakamura team is in conference room A. I have your notes ready, and I'll bring fresh coffee." I said, "Sit down." This time it was an order, delivered in the tone that made board members scramble to obey. Elena sat, but even that simple movement looked like it cost her. Alessandro found himself crossing the distance between them without conscious decision, his meeting forgotten. Up close, the changes he'd been willfully ignoring became impossible to dismiss. The sharpness of her collarbones above the neckline of her blouse, the way her skirt hung loose at her waist, the fine tremor in her hands that she tried to hide by clasping them together. Most damning of all, the absolute exhaustion in her eyes that she attempted to mask with professional courtesy. "When did you last eat?" he asked again, the question he'd asked 6 weeks ago, the question he should have followed up on then. "I had breakfast," she replied, the same automatic response. "What did you have?" "Coffee." "Cristo," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Elena, you can't survive on coffee." "I also had half a granola bar at my desk around 9, she offered, as if this was a perfectly reasonable diet for a 12-hour workday. "I'm fine, really." "The meeting can wait." He pulled out his phone, texted his VP to start the meeting without him, then crouched down so he was eye level with her seated position. This close, he could see the fine lines of stress around her mouth, the way she held herself with rigid control as if relaxation might lead to collapse. "Elena, look at me." She did, and for the first time in 3 months of working together, he saw past the professional mask to the desperation underneath. The fear, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been pushing beyond human limits for too long. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. "I have this under control, Mr. Vittorio." "You're shaking." "I just need a moment." "I'll be fine. Stop saying you're fine," he said, and there was an edge to his voice that made her eyes widen. "You're not fine. You haven't been fine for weeks. Talk to me." For a long moment, she just stared at him, and he could see her weighing options, calculating risks. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't afford to not be fine." Something in those words hit him like a physical blow. "What does that mean?" "It means I need this job, Mr. Vittorio. I need it more than I need sleep or food or—" She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together as if she'd revealed too much. But Alessandro was already putting pieces together. The worn clothes, the way she never took lunch, the early arrivals and late departures that went beyond dedication into something closer to desperation. "You're working another job," he said, and it wasn't a question. She closed her eyes briefly, and that was answer enough. "Where?" "Night shift at Mercy General Hospital. I'm a medical records clerk, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week." The words landed in the space between them with devastating clarity. Alessandro did the math automatically. If she was here from 7 a.m. to 8 or 9 p.m. most days, then worked 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 nights a week, then she was getting at most 2 hours of sleep on those days, maybe 4 on her nights off. No wonder she looked half dead. No wonder she'd been slowly disappearing. She was literally working herself into the ground. "You're going to kill yourself," he said flatly. "I'm managing. You just nearly fainted at your desk." "I didn't faint. I got a little dizzy." "Elena, I have student loans, Mr. Vittorio," she interrupted. And there was something fierce in her voice now, defensive pride rising up. $63,000 from a degree I couldn't finish because my mother got sick and I had to drop out to take care of her. I have rent in a building that's barely legal in the Bronx. I have medical bills from when I didn't have insurance last year and got bronchitis. I can't afford to work just one job. I can't afford to eat lunch out. I can't afford to be weak. The raw honesty of it, the dignity in her voice even as she confessed to struggling, did something to Alessandro that he didn't have words for. Here was a woman working 2 full-time jobs, running on empty, sacrificing her health and well-being, and still maintaining the poise and competence that had made her the best secretary he'd ever had, still showing up every day with that quiet pride intact, still never complaining, never making excuses, never asking for special treatment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because it's not your problem," she said simply. "You pay me well for the hours I work here. What I do with the rest of my time is my business. It becomes my business when you're collapsing from exhaustion in my office." "I'm not." She started to protest, tried to stand to prove her point, and that's when it happened. One moment Elena was attempting to rise from her chair, determination in every line of her body. The next, her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she was falling. Alessandro caught her before she hit the floor, but barely. The momentum sent them both down, him on his knees on the marble with her unconscious form cradled against his chest. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, his mind went completely blank. Then training kicked in. "Call 911. He shouted toward the cluster of assistants who'd appeared at the commotion. "Now." His hands moved automatically, checking her pulse, which was rapid and thready, tilting her head to ensure her airway was clear. Her skin was cold, clammy, her breathing shallow. And she was so light in his arms, so insubstantial, as if she'd been slowly fading and he'd been too blind to see. "Elena," he said, patting her cheek gently. "Elena, open your eyes." Nothing. Just that terrifying stillness. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes, though it felt like forever. Alessandro refused to let go of her even as the paramedics tried to take over, finally relinquishing her only when they physically needed space to work. They checked her vitals, asked questions he tried to answer. Had she hit her head? He didn't think so. He'd caught her. Any medical conditions he knew of? No, but clearly something was very wrong. When did she last eat? He had to admit he didn't know, which felt like a failure of catastrophic proportions. "We need to transport her," the lead paramedic said, already preparing the gurney. "Looks like severe exhaustion, possibly malnutrition, definitely dehydration. She needs fluids and monitoring." "I'm coming with her," Alessandro stated, in a tone that left no room for argument. "Sir, are you family? I'm her employer and I'm responsible for this." That wasn't entirely true, but he made it sound like absolute fact. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, he was sitting in a hospital corridor still wearing his suit, his phone vibrating constantly with messages he ignored, waiting for news about his secretary, who worked 2 full-time jobs because she couldn't afford to survive on what even his generous salary provided. The guilt was corrosive. He'd noticed her deteriorating. He'd seen the signs, and he'd done nothing, because it was easier to maintain professional distance, easier to pretend employee problems weren't his concern, easier to focus on empire building than on the woman who made that empire function smoothly. A doctor emerged after 45 minutes, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Mr. Vittorio? I'm Dr. Patterson. You brought in Elena Martinez? How is she?" He was on his feet instantly. "Stable now. We've got her on IV fluids and she's regained consciousness. The immediate crisis is severe dehydration combined with exhaustion and malnutrition. Her potassium and sodium levels are dangerously low. Her blood sugar crashed. And frankly, I'm amazed she stayed on her feet as long as she did. Can I see her?" "In a moment. First, I need to ask you some questions." Miss Martinez was reluctant to provide information. Of course she was, Alessandro thought grimly, because even unconscious and hospitalized, Elena was trying to maintain control, trying to not be a burden. "What do you need to know?" She mentioned working 2 jobs. "Can you confirm that?" "Yes, she works as my executive assistant approximately 60 to 70 hours a week, and apparently also works night shifts at Mercy General Hospital." Dr. Patterson's expression tightened. That's approximately 110 hours a week between 2 jobs. That leaves roughly 8 hours a day for commuting, eating, and sleeping. Likely less given New York traffic patterns. I wasn't aware of the second job until today, Alessandro said, and hated how defensive he sounded. She never mentioned it. No, I imagine she wouldn't. People in survival mode rarely ask for help. The words landed like an accusation. Miss Martinez is severely malnourished. I'd estimate she's been consuming less than 800 calories a day for at least 6 weeks. Possibly longer. Her body has been cannibalizing muscle mass to function. If she'd continued at this pace, we'd be looking at organ failure within a few months. The clinical assessment hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Organ failure. His efficient, dignified, quietly desperate secretary had been months away from literal death, and he'd been too wrapped up in meetings and deals to intervene. What does she need? Rest, primarily. Proper nutrition. Time to recover. I'm keeping her overnight for observation and to get her stabilized, but she needs follow-up care. Does she have health insurance? Yes. Through my company. Full coverage. Good. Because she's going to need it. I'm also mandating at least 2 weeks off work, possibly longer depending on her recovery. Elena was going to hate that, Alessandro knew. Taking time off meant losing her night job income, meant falling further behind on the bills she was desperately trying to pay, which meant she'd try to come back early, push herself again, end up right back here or worse, unless someone intervened. Unless someone took away the need to destroy herself for survival. Can I see her now? Alessandro asked. Dr. Patterson studied him for a moment, her gaze assessing. Room 347. She's awake, but weak. Try not to upset her. The warning was pointed, and Alessandro nodded acknowledgement before heading down the corridor. He found Elena in a private room, propped up slightly on pillows, an IV in her arm and monitors beeping quietly. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable in the hospital gown, her hair loose from its usual neat bun, falling around her shoulders in waves he'd never seen before. When she saw him in the doorway, her eyes widened and color flooded her pale cheeks. Mr. Vittorio, she started, already trying to sit up straighter despite her obvious weakness. I'm so sorry about the meeting. I'll make it up. I can come in tomorrow, stop. He crossed to her bedside, pulling up the visitor's chair and sitting down so they were at eye level. Just stop, Elena. But the Nakamura deal is being handled by my VP, who is perfectly capable. The world didn't end because I missed a meeting. You shouldn't have been working yourself to death, he interrupted, and there was an edge to his voice that made her flinch. You shouldn't have been surviving on coffee and granola bars. You shouldn't have been hiding a second full-time job that was killing you. Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. I didn't have a choice. There are always choices, Elena. Not when you have my bills. There aren't. She shot back, and there was fire in her voice now, pride and desperation warring in her expression. Not when you're one paycheck away from homelessness. Not when you have debt collectors calling 3 times a day. You don't understand what it's like to. She stopped abruptly, seeming to realize who she was talking to. I apologize, Mr. Vittorio. That was inappropriate. It was honest, he corrected quietly. And you're right, I don't understand what that's like. I've never had to choose between eating and paying rent. I've never had to work 2 jobs just to survive. I've never experienced that kind of desperation. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. But I understand something else, Elena. I understand that the woman who's been keeping my entire operation running smoothly for 3 months, who's never missed a deadline or made a significant error, who's maintained grace and dignity under impossible circumstances, is worth more than I'm currently paying her. Elena stared at him, confusion flickering across her exhausted face. I don't understand. Your salary is being doubled, effective immediately, Alessandro stated, as if announcing a stock merger rather than changing someone's life. And you're quitting your night job as of today. I can't. You can, and you will. Doctor's orders are 2 weeks minimum off work. You're taking a month, fully paid. When you return, your new salary will be sufficient to cover your expenses without requiring supplemental employment. The tears she'd been fighting spilled over. Mr. Vittorio, I can't accept that. It's too much. I haven't earned. You've earned it by being the best assistant I've ever had. You've earned it by your competence, your dedication, your discretion. You've earned it by nearly killing yourself rather than letting my operations suffer. He reached out, surprising himself, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The gesture was intimate, inappropriate, and completely instinctive. And you've earned it by making me realize that I've been so focused on building an empire that I forgot the empire runs on people. Real people, with real needs. Her breath caught at his touch, and Alessandro became suddenly, acutely aware of how close he was sitting, how her eyes had widened, how the monitor beside her bed showed her heart rate increasing. He should pull back, should maintain professional distance, should not be noticing how the tears made her dark eyes luminous, or how vulnerable she looked in this moment, or how the urge to protect her was overwhelming every rational thought in his head. Why? She whispered. Why do you care? It was a fair question, and Alessandro found he didn't have a simple answer. When had his perfectly efficient secretary become more than just another employee? When had her well-being become something that could make his chest tight with worry? When had the thought of her suffering become intolerable? Because, he said slowly, still holding her gaze, somewhere between your first day and today, you became important to me. Not just as an employee, as a person. The confession hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Elena's eyes searched his face as if looking for deception or ulterior motives. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften. I've been trying so hard not to let you see me as a person, she admitted quietly, because being professional, being perfect, keeping that distance, it was the only way I could survive working for you. What do you mean? You don't know what you do to people, Mr. Vittorio. The way you walk into a room and everything just stops. The way your attention feels like standing in front of a spotlight. The way working for you is both the most terrifying and most thrilling thing I've ever done. Her voice dropped even lower. I couldn't let you see that I was struggling because I thought if I showed any weakness, any need, I'd lose this job. And I couldn't lose this job because it was the only good thing in my life. The words hit Alessandro harder than any business setback ever had. She'd been terrified of him, or at least terrified of disappointing him, to the point of self-destruction, and he'd been so wrapped up in maintaining his reputation as a demanding, exacting boss that he'd never considered the human cost. You're not going to lose this job, he said firmly, not because of this. Not ever. Unless you choose to leave. You say that now, I mean it, Elena. You're the best assistant I've ever had, and I have no intention of letting you go. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But more than that, I'm not going to let you destroy yourself. Not for this job. Not for any job. Whatever you need, better salary, reasonable hours, support with your debt, we're going to figure it out together. Why would you do that for me? Because you matter, he said simply, and the truth of it resonated in his chest like a bell. She mattered. Somehow, this woman with her quiet dignity and hidden desperation had become important to him in a way that went far beyond professional respect. They sat there in silence for a moment, just looking at each other, and Alessandro felt something shift between them. The barrier of employer-employee, the carefully maintained professional distance, it was cracking, revealing something underneath that was both terrifying and inevitable. I should let you rest, he finally said, though he made no move to stand. The Nakamura deal. We'll be there when you're recovered. Everything will be there. The world doesn't stop turning, but it also doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself. He stood, reluctantly breaking the moment. I'll have my driver take your keys and pack some things from your apartment. You're staying tonight for observation, and then tomorrow I need to go home, Elena interrupted. I have my cat, and my neighbor who feeds her is only doing it as a favor, and I need to cancel my shift at the hospital. I'll handle it," Alessandro said. "All of it. Just tell me what you need." For a long moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, that stubborn pride rising up. Then exhaustion seemed to overwhelm her, and she slumped back against the pillows. "My neighbor is Mrs. Chen in 4B. She has the spare key. My cat's name is Mochi, and she needs to be fed twice a day. The food is in the cupboard above the sink." "Mochi," Alessandro repeated, filing away this small detail about his secretary's life outside the office. "Anything else?" "My supervisor at Mercy General is Mark Rodriguez. I should call him. Give me his number. I'll explain the situation." "Mr. Vittorio, you can't just Elena," he interrupted gently. "Let me help. You've been carrying everything alone for too long. Let someone else take some of the weight." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "I don't know how to do that." "Then learn," he said softly, "starting now." He left her then, before he could do something truly inappropriate like brush away those tears or smooth back her hair or admit that seeing her in that hospital bed had terrified him in a way nothing in his carefully controlled life had prepared him for. In the corridor, he made calls. First to his driver, arranging for Elena's apartment to be handled, then to her supervisor at Mercy General, explaining in terms that brooked no argument that Miss Martinez would not be returning to her position due to health concerns. Finally to his own office, instructing his VP to clear his schedule for the remainder of the day. Then Alessandro Vittorio, who never took unscheduled time off, who ran his empire with ruthless efficiency and emotional distance, sat in a hospital waiting room and confronted the uncomfortable truth that somewhere in the past 3 months, his perfect secretary had become something much more dangerous. She'd become someone he couldn't bear to lose. Someone whose pain affected him personally. Someone who made him want to be more than just a billionaire building skyscrapers. Someone who made him want to be the kind of man worthy of her quiet strength and dignity. The next morning, Alessandro arrived at the hospital at 7 a.m. with a bag packed from Elena's apartment, though calling it an apartment was generous. When his driver had sent photos from the address in the Bronx, Alessandro had been shocked. The building looked one strong wind away from condemnation, with peeling paint, broken security door, and stairs that seemed structurally questionable. Elena's studio was barely 300 square feet, most of that taken up by a futon that doubled as her bed and couch, a tiny kitchenette with a hot plate, and stacks of textbooks from the college degree she'd never finished. The only personal touches were photos of a woman who must have been her mother, and a small orange cat who'd regarded the intruder with suspicious green eyes. His driver had packed clothes as requested, but Alessandro had made additional arrangements. By the time Elena was discharged that afternoon, there would be movers clearing out that death trap apartment and relocating her belongings to a safe, clean studio in a building he owned in Murray Hill. She was going to protest, he knew. That stubborn pride would flare up, but he was Alessandro Vittorio, and when he decided something needed to happen, it happened. Elena was awake when he arrived, sitting up in bed picking at a hospital breakfast tray. She looked better than yesterday, some color back in her cheeks, but still too thin, too fragile. "Mr. Vittorio," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "You didn't need to come back. I brought your things." He set the bag on the visitor's chair. "And I need to discuss some arrangements." Wariness crept into her expression. "What kind of arrangements?" "You're being discharged this afternoon. You can't go back to that apartment." "Excuse me? It's not safe, Elena. The building has code violations, the neighborhood is dangerous, and you're recovering from a medical crisis. I've arranged for you to stay in one of my properties in Murray Hill. The building has a doorman, security. It's close to the office for when you're ready to return." "No." The word was flat, final. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Vittorio, but I'm not accepting charity. It's not charity. It's a benefit of employment. You don't provide housing to other employees." "I don't have other employees who collapsed from malnutrition in my office," Alessandro countered. And I don't have other employees whose living conditions are actively detrimental to their health and recovery. Elena's jaw tightened. That apartment is what I can afford. I don't need you to rescue me. This isn't about rescue. It's about, he stopped, searching for words. It's about me not being able to function knowing you're living in a building that should be condemned, recovering from exhaustion in a space barely fit for habitation. Why do you care where I live? Because I care about you, he said, the words emerging before he could stop them. Because seeing you unconscious on my office floor was the worst moment I've experienced in years. Because I can't just go back to pretending your well-being doesn't matter to me. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Elena stared at him, something complicated flickering across her face. Mr. Vittorio. Alessandro. He interrupted. When we're not in the office, call me Alessandro. I can't do that. Why not? Because there are lines, professional boundaries, and we're already blurring them by having this conversation. If I start calling you Alessandro, if I accept an apartment from you, if I let this become something other than employer-employee. She stopped, shaking her head. It's dangerous. What's dangerous about it? You, she said quietly. You're dangerous to me. The admission hung in the air between them. Alessandro felt his heart rate accelerate, felt something shift in his chest. Explain. Elena took a breath, seeming to gather courage. From the first day I walked into your office, I knew you were going to be a problem. Not because you're demanding or difficult, but because of how you made me feel. Like every other thought evaporated when you looked at me. Like I wanted to be perfect for you, in a way that had nothing to do with keeping my job. Her voice dropped. I've been trying so hard to maintain distance, to keep everything professional, because the alternative was admitting that somewhere between filing your contracts and managing your schedule, I started feeling things I had no business feeling for my boss. Alessandro's breath caught. What kind of things? The kind that make me notice when you loosen your tie at the end of a long day. The kind that make my heart race when you say my name. The kind that make me want to smooth the stress lines from your forehead when you're frustrated. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The kind that made me push myself too hard because the only time I felt truly alive was during those hours in your office, being near you. The confession should have alarmed him, should have triggered his instincts for self-preservation, for maintaining the emotional distance that had always served him well. Instead, Alessandro found himself moving closer to her bed, his hands gripping the rail. And if I told you I've been fighting the same battle? He asked, his voice rough. That I've noticed every small thing about you? The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're nervous, the way your eyes light up when you've solved a particularly complex problem. He leaned closer. What if I told you that the reason I worked late so many nights wasn't just dedication to the business, but because leaving meant not seeing you anymore? That I started finding excuses to call you into my office just to have you near? That watching you deteriorate and doing nothing about it was eating me alive because the thought of you suffering was unbearable? Elena's breathing had quickened, her eyes locked on his. Then I'd say we have a serious problem. Why is it a problem? Because you're Alessandro Vittorio. You're a billionaire. You've dated supermodels and actresses. You move in circles I can't even imagine. And I'm your secretary who lives in the Bronx and has more debt than assets. This isn't a fairy tale, Mr. Vittorio. This is real life. And in real life, these stories don't end well. You're wrong, Alessandro said quietly. In real life, these stories end however we choose to write them. He reached out, gently taking her hand. The touch sent electricity up his arm, and he saw her pupils dilate in response. I'm not interested in supermodels or actresses, Elena. I'm interested in a woman who has more strength and dignity in her little finger than most people have in their entire being. A woman who worked herself to the point of collapse rather than compromise her principles. A woman who makes me want to be better than just a ruthless businessman building towers. You don't really know me, she whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. Then, let me learn, he said. Let me know everything. Your favorite color, your dreams, what makes you laugh, what keeps you awake at night, beyond just debt and fear. Let me see all of you, not just the perfect professional mask you wear in the office. And when you realize I'm just ordinary, when the novelty wears off, you've never been ordinary, Elena. And this isn't novelty. This is, he stopped, searching for the right word. This is inevitable. It's been building since the moment you walked into my office for that interview and looked me in the eye without flinching. I just didn't recognize it until I thought I might lose you. Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want you to take the apartment in Murray Hill, not as charity, but because I need to know you're safe while you recover. I'm saying that when you're ready to return to work, it will be with reasonable hours and fair compensation. And I'm saying that I want the chance to explore whatever this is between us without the pressure of professional hierarchy complicating everything. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm saying I care about you, Elena, and I'm done pretending otherwise. A tear slipped down her cheek. This is crazy, probably, he agreed with a slight smile. But the alternative is going back to pretending, maintaining distance, and I've discovered I'm not capable of that anymore. Not with you. The other employees, they'll talk if they find out you're giving me special treatment. Let them talk. I've never cared about gossip before. I'm not starting now. Mr. Vittorio. Alessandro. He corrected again. Say it, please. She took a shaky breath. Alessandro. Hearing his name in her voice, soft and uncertain and intimate, did something to him. Without thinking, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles while holding her gaze. There, he murmured against her skin. That wasn't so difficult, was it? Her breathing had gone shallow. This is a terrible idea. Probably the worst I've ever had, he agreed, but he didn't let go of her hand. But I'm known for taking calculated risks. And you, Elena Martinez, are a risk I'm willing to take. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The air between them charged with possibility and fear, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Then Elena did something that surprised them both. She tugged on his hand, pulling him closer, and raised her free hand to his face, her fingers trembling as they traced his jawline. If we do this, she said quietly, if we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were. I don't want to go back, Alessandro replied, his voice rough. I want to move forward. With you. I'm terrified, she admitted. So am I, he confessed. I've built my entire life around control, around keeping emotions separate from business, around never letting anyone close enough to affect me. And then you came along and destroyed every carefully constructed wall without even trying. He turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. You terrify me, Elena. The intensity of what I feel terrifies me, but the thought of not exploring this, of always wondering what might have been, that terrifies me more. She was crying now, tears flowing freely, but there was a smile on her face. What do we do? First, you accept the apartment and focus on recovering. Doctor's orders are a month off work, and you're going to take it. No arguments. Alessandro, no arguments, he repeated firmly. Your health is non-negotiable. While you're recovering, I'll handle transitioning you away from your night job permanently, and we'll set up a payment plan for your student loans that won't require you to sacrifice your well-being. I can't let you pay my debts. I'm not paying them. You are, from your new salary, at a rate that allows you to actually live like a human being instead of a machine. It will take longer to pay off, but you'll survive the process. He stroked his thumb across her knuckles. And while you're recovering, we'll spend time together. Real time, outside the office, without the pressure of work. I'll take you to dinner. We'll talk. I'll learn what makes you smile. We'll figure out if this thing between us is real or just proximity and intensity. And if it is real, then we'll figure that out too, he said. Together, Elena searched his face, and whatever she saw there must have convinced her because she nodded slowly. Okay. Okay to the apartment? Okay to all of it. The apartment, the time off, she paused, seeming to gather courage. The chance to see what this could be, but Alessandro, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if this doesn't work out, if we try and it turns out to be a mistake, that I won't lose my job. That we can find a way to work together professionally, even if the personal doesn't work. It was a fair request, and a smart one. Elena was still protecting herself, still planning for contingencies. It was part of what made her so good at her job, but it also revealed how little she believed anyone would choose her when complications arose. I promise. Alessandro said solemnly. Your position is secure regardless of what happens between us personally. But Elena, I need you to promise me something too. What? Promise me you'll actually give this a real chance. That you won't sabotage it out of fear or because you think you're not good enough, or because the class difference makes you uncomfortable. Promise me you'll let yourself be open to the possibility that this could work. She bit her lip, clearly wrestling with the request. I don't know if I can promise that. My instinct is to protect myself, to expect the worst. I know, he said gently, and I'm not asking you to change who you are. Just to try. To let me prove that you can trust me. That I see you for who you really are, and that's exactly who I want. Okay. She whispered. I'll try. That's all I ask. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, their hands still intertwined. This close he could smell the faint lavender of her shampoo, could see the golden flecks in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. We're really doing this, she murmured, wonder in her voice. We're really doing this, he confirmed. Then, because he'd been wanting to since the moment he'd seen her in that hospital bed, because the pull between them was too strong to resist any longer, Alessandro closed the small distance and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, a question more than a demand. Her lips were soft against his, trembling slightly, and for a moment she froze. Then she responded, her free hand sliding up to curl in his hair, kissing him back with a sweetness that made his chest ache. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Elena's eyes were wide and slightly dazed. Oh, she said softly. Oh, indeed, Alessandro agreed, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. Still think this is a terrible idea? The worst, she confirmed. But she was smiling. But I'm starting to think maybe terrible ideas are worth pursuing. He laughed, the sound rusty from disuse, and kissed her forehead. Rest now. I have arrangements to make for your new apartment, and I need to coordinate the movers. You're really serious about this? About the apartment? Or about you? Both. Deadly serious about both, he confirmed. You're going to learn, Elena, that when I decide I want something, I'm extraordinarily persistent about acquiring it. And I've decided I want you. In my life. Healthy, safe, and happy. Everything else is just logistics. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the kitchen of her new Murray Hill apartment, still marveling at the space. It was easily 3 times the size of her old studio, with actual separate rooms, modern appliances, and windows that looked out over the city instead of a brick wall. Mochi had adapted immediately, claiming the sunny windowsill as her new favorite perch, and regarding the upgrade as her rightful due. Elena herself was still adjusting. The building had a doorman who greeted her by name, a gym she'd never use, and neighbors who seemed to work in finance and law rather than struggling to make rent. It felt surreal, like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. But the most surreal part was Alessandro. True to his word, he'd spent the past 3 weeks courting her with a focus and intensity that left her breathless. Dinners at restaurants she'd only read about in magazines. Long walks through Central Park where they talked for hours. Quiet evenings in her new apartment where he'd bring takeout and they'd watch movies on her couch with Mochi wedged between them, judging them with feline superiority. He'd learned her favorite color was deep purple, that she'd wanted to be a nurse before financial reality forced her to drop out, that she loved old black and white movies and terrible romantic comedies in equal measure. She'd learned that he played piano but never in front of anyone, that his favorite food was actually simple pasta carbonara despite access to the finest cuisine, that he'd built his empire partly to prove his father wrong about him being too soft for business. They'd talked about everything and nothing, building something neither of them had words for. And they'd been careful. Despite the intensity between them, Alessandro hadn't pushed for more than kisses and held hands, respecting both her recovery and the newness of whatever they were building. But tonight was different. Tonight was the first time she was cooking for him. A simple dinner of pasta and salad. Nothing fancy. And tonight was the first time since that kiss in the hospital that they'd be truly alone together without the safety net of public spaces or planned activities. Elena was nervous in a way that had nothing to do with her cooking skills. The knock on her door came at exactly 7 p.m. because Alessandro was nothing if not punctual. She opened it to find him standing there in dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, the most casual she'd ever seen him, holding a bottle of wine and looking almost as nervous as she felt. "Hi," she said, suddenly shy. "Hi," he replied, his eyes doing that thing where they seemed to see right through her. "You look beautiful." She glanced down at her simple dress, nothing special, but the way he looked at her made her feel like she was wearing something precious. "Come in. Dinner's almost ready." He followed her to the kitchen, setting the wine on the counter and moving with the ease of someone who'd been there before, which he had, multiple times. But tonight felt different. The air between them was charged, heavy with anticipation and unspoken possibilities. "Can I help?" he asked. "You can open the wine," she said, stirring the pasta sauce. "Everything else is under control." They moved around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease, like a dance they'd practiced. Alessandro opened the wine, poured 2 glasses, handed her one. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Elena felt that now familiar jolt of electricity. "To new beginnings," Alessandro said, raising his glass. To taking terrible risks, Elena countered with a small smile. They clinked glasses, eyes locked, and drank. The wine was excellent, of course. Everything Alessandro touched seemed to be excellent. Dinner was simple, but good. They sat at her small table, knees occasionally bumping underneath, talking about everything and nothing. Alessandro told her about a deal that had gone wrong that day, actually showing frustration and vulnerability rather than the perfect control he maintained at work. Elena shared her fear about returning to the office next week, about how people would react to her being gone so long. "They'll be glad to have you back," Alessandro assured her. "My current temp is competent, but she's not you." "No one could be you. You're biased," Elena said, but she smiled. Completely, he agreed without shame. "But I'm also right." After dinner they moved to the couch, wine glasses refilled, Mochi conspicuously absent as if she knew they needed privacy. Alessandro sat close enough that Elena could feel his warmth, far enough that she didn't feel crowded. For a while, they just sat in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling through the windows. "Can I ask you something?" Elena finally said. "Anything. Why me?" She turned to face him. "You could have anyone. Models, actresses, women who fit into your world. Why choose someone like me who's complicated and comes with debt and problems?" Alessandro set down his wine glass and took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles in that gesture that had become familiar. Do you want the business answer or the truth? Both. The business answer is that you're brilliant, capable, and an asset to my company. Investing in you makes logical sense. He paused. The truth is messier. The truth is that you make me feel things I've spent years avoiding. You make me want to be more than just a ruthless businessman. You challenge me without trying. See through my masks without effort. When you collapsed in my office, I realized that somewhere along the way, you'd become essential to me. Not just professionally, but personally. Fundamentally. The thought of losing you was unbearable. His eyes held hers, intense and vulnerable. You asked why you? My question is why anyone else when you exist? Elena felt tears prick her eyes. I'm still afraid this is a dream, that I'll wake up back in that Bronx apartment, back to working 2 jobs, and this will all have been exhaustion-induced fantasy. Then let me prove it's real. Alessandro said softly. He shifted closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. Let me show you that this isn't a dream or a fantasy. That I'm real. What I feel is real, and you deserve every good thing that's happening. He kissed her then, and it was different from the gentle kisses they'd shared before. This was deeper, more intense, carrying weeks of careful restraint and building desire. Elena responded without thinking, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, then into his hair, pulling him closer. Alessandro made a low sound in his throat and pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her against him like she was precious and necessary, and his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena's careful control had shattered. Alessandro, she whispered against his lips. Tell me what you need, he said, his hands moving restlessly across her back. Tell me what you want. You, she admitted. I want you. All of you. I'm tired of being careful and afraid and holding back. Elena, I'm recovered. I'm healthy. I'm sure, she interrupted, looking into his eyes. I want this. I want you. If you want me too. Alessandro's eyes darkened, his hands tightening on her waist. If I want you? Cristo. Elena. I've been half insane wanting you. But I won't rush this. I won't make you feel like this is expected or required or. She stopped his words with a kiss, pouring everything she'd been feeling into it. All the longing, all the fear, all the growing certainty that this man, impossible as it seemed, was becoming essential to her. When she pulled back, there was no uncertainty in her eyes. This is my choice. You've given me everything else. Space, time, safety, the chance to heal. Let me choose this too. Let me choose you. Something in Alessandro's expression shifted, the careful control he'd been maintaining cracking. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything, Alana said, and meant it. What happened next was tender, intense, overwhelming. Alessandro carried her to the bedroom as if she weighed nothing, laid her down on the bed with a gentleness that made her throat tight. He undressed her slowly, reverently, kissing every inch of skin he revealed like she was something precious. You're beautiful, he whispered against her collarbone, her ribs, the curve of her hip. Perfect. I'm not. You are to me, he interrupted, rising to shed his own clothes, and Elena's breath caught because Alessandro Vittorio fully revealed was a work of art. Lean muscle, powerful shoulders, the kind of body that came from disciplined gym sessions rather than vanity. But it was his eyes that held her, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. When he finally settled over her, skin to skin, the world narrowed to just this. His weight, his warmth, the way his hands trembled slightly as they mapped her body. Tell me if anything is too much, he said against her neck. Tell me if you need me to stop. Don't stop, she whispered. Please don't stop. What followed was everything Elena had dreamed about in the quiet moments she'd allowed herself to want him. He was tender and passionate, careful and intense, making sure she felt everything, that her pleasure mattered more than his own. When she finally shattered in his arms, crying out his name, Alessandro followed moments later, her name on his lips like a prayer. Afterward, they lay tangled together, hearts racing, breathing slowly returning to normal. Alessandro held her close, his hand stroking through her hair, and Elena felt something settle in her chest, something that felt dangerously like belonging. "Stay," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Not tonight. Not ever if you'll have me." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in years, Elena felt completely safe. The next morning, Alessandro woke first, carefully extracting himself from Elena's embrace to start coffee in her kitchen. He was standing at the counter, waiting for the machine to finish, when Mochi appeared and wound around his ankles, purring approval. "Your human is special," he told the cat seriously. "I plan to keep her, if she'll let me." Mochi meowed, which he chose to interpret as approval. When Elena emerged 20 minutes later, sleepy and rumpled in one of his shirts she'd claimed, Alessandro felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. This was what he wanted. Not just the passion of last night, but this too. Morning coffee and shared smiles and building a life together. "Morning," she said, accepting the coffee he offered. "How do you feel?" "Like I just had the best night of my life," he said honestly. "Like I never want to leave this apartment." Elena laughed, but there was something uncertain in her eyes. "About that. About last night." "I don't want you to think that I stop," he interrupted gently. "Whatever you're about to say, whatever worry is brewing in that brilliant mind, stop. Last night was perfect. You were perfect. And nothing about it changes what we're building unless you want it to. I just don't want you to think I'm easy, or that I do this or—" He set down his coffee and pulled her into his arms, cutting off the spiral of insecurity with a kiss. "Elena Maria Martinez," he said against her lips. "You are the least easy person I've ever met. You've made me work for every smile, every moment of trust, every step closer. Last night was a gift you chose to give me, and I will treasure it and you every day if you let me." Tears welled in her eyes. "How do you always know what to say?" "I don't," he admitted. "I'm figuring this out as I go. But I know that you're important to me, that what we're building matters, and that I want to keep building it for as long as you'll have me." They spent the rest of the weekend in her apartment, barely leaving except for necessities. They cooked together, watched movies, talked about dreams and fears and possibilities. Alessandro opened up about his childhood in ways he never had with anyone, about the coldness of his upbringing, the impossibly high standards, the way love was always conditional on achievement. Elena shared her own struggles, the medical bills from her mother's illness that had destroyed their savings, the guilt of not being able to save her, the years of grinding poverty that followed, and through it all, they built something. Trust. Understanding. A foundation. When Alessandro finally returned to his penthouse Sunday night, it was only because they both had work the next day and needed to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But he took with him the memory of Elena's smile, her laugh, the way she felt in his arms, the certainty that somehow, impossibly, he'd found something more valuable than all his skyscrapers combined. Monday morning, Alessandro arrived at his office early, as always, but for the first time in years, work didn't feel like the most important thing in his life. That space was now occupied by a woman with quiet dignity and hidden strength who'd somehow seen past his money and reputation to the man underneath. Elena returned to work the following week, and Alessandro discovered that having the woman you were falling in love with as your secretary was both wonderful and torture. Wonderful because she was there, efficient and brilliant, and occasionally flashing him small, secret smiles that no one else saw. Torture because professional distance when you'd spent the previous night tangled together was nearly impossible to maintain. They'd agreed to keep their relationship private, at least initially. Elena had insisted, worried about office politics and accusations of favoritism. Alessandro had reluctantly agreed, though he wanted to announce to the entire company that Elena Martinez was his, and off-limits to everyone else. The first real test came 2 weeks after her return, when Marcus Chen from the Hong Kong office visited headquarters. Marcus was brilliant, ambitious, and had never hidden his interest in Elena despite Alessandro's pointed discouragement. "Elena," Marcus said warmly when he spotted her at her desk. "You look wonderful. I heard you were ill?" "I'm fully recovered," she replied professionally, though Alessandro noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. "Thank you for asking. We should have dinner while I'm in town," Marcus suggested, leaning against her desk with studied casualness. "Catch up properly." "That's kind. But I don't think." "She's busy," Alessandro interrupted, emerging from his office with an expression that made Marcus straighten immediately. "Miss Martinez's schedule is quite full with the Nakamura expansion project." It was a blatant lie. The Nakamura project wasn't even Elena's responsibility. But Alessandro discovered he was absolutely not equipped to watch another man flirt with his woman without intervening. Marcus raised an eyebrow but had enough sense not to argue with his boss. Another time, perhaps. When he'd retreated, Elena turned to Alessandro with amused exasperation. "That was subtle. He was bothering you. He was being friendly." "He wants to date you," Alessandro said flatly. "I know what that looks like." "And you decided to mark your territory?" She kept her voice low, but there was a smile playing at her lips. "Is that what I was doing?" Very clearly, she stood, moving close enough that only he could hear. "You know I'm yours, right? That weekend we spent together, what we've been building, you don't have to worry about." "I know," he interrupted softly. "Logically, I know. But seeing another man look at you like that, it makes me want to do very unprofessional things." "Like what?" "Like kiss you right here in the office," he admitted. "Like tell everyone that you're mine. Like make sure every man in this building knows you're completely off limits." Elena's breath caught. "We agreed to keep this private." "I know. And I will. But Cristo, Elena, it's harder than I expected." She glanced around to confirm they weren't observed, then quickly squeezed his hand. "Tonight. Come to my apartment tonight and you can be as possessive as you want." The promise in her voice made Alessandro's temperature spike. "You're dangerous to my productivity." "Good," she said with a smile. "Now go back to your meeting." "The board is waiting," he did, but spent the entire meeting thinking about tonight. About Elena. About how impossible it was to maintain professional distance when every instinct screamed to claim her publicly. The situation came to a head a month later at the annual company gala. It was the biggest social event of the year, held at the Plaza Hotel with hundreds of employees, investors, and business partners in attendance. Alessandro was expected to attend with a date, usually some actress or model his PR team suggested for good optics. This year he'd gone alone, unable to stomach the idea of having anyone but Elena on his arm. Elena was there in her professional capacity, coordinating last-minute logistics and managing the endless small crises that came with an event of this scale. She wore a simple black dress that somehow made her more beautiful than any of the designer-clad women in attendance, and Alessandro found it physically painful not to be able to touch her, claim her, show the world that she was his. He watched her move through the crowd, solving problems, smoothing over difficulties, being absolutely indispensable. And he watched other men notice her too. Jonathan Fraser from the London office asked her to dance. She politely declined, citing work. David Martinez from legal brought her champagne. She accepted with professional courtesy that made Alessandro's jaw clench. But it was Richard Morrison, a major investor and notorious playboy, who finally pushed Alessandro past his limit. You must be Alessandro's secret weapon, Richard said, cornering Elena near the bar. I've heard about the brilliant secretary who keeps his empire running. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Morrison, Elena replied, maintaining professional distance. You're far too modest, and far too beautiful to be wasting your talents on secretarial work. A woman like you should be running her own division. His hand landed on the small of her back, possessive and presumptuous. Perhaps we could discuss career opportunities over dinner? Alessandro was across the ballroom in seconds, his control shattered. Morrison, he said coldly, his hand firmly removing Richard's from Elena's back and replacing it with his own. Miss Martinez's career path is not your concern. Richard's eyebrows rose. Vittorio, I was just harassing my employee. Yes, I noticed. Alessandro's voice was ice. I suggest you focus on the investors who actually welcome your attention. He guided Elena away firmly, his hand still possessive on her back, aware that people were watching but beyond caring. Alessandro, Elena murmured as they moved through the crowd. People are staring. Let them, he said tightly. I'm done pretending you don't matter to me. He led her out to the plaza's terrace, away from the gala, into the cool night air. Only then did he release her, pacing like a caged animal. I can't do this anymore, he said. Can't do what? Pretend you're just my secretary. Watch other men touch you, flirt with you. Look at you like you're available when you're mine. He turned to face her, and there was something wild in his eyes. You're mine, Elena. I know we agreed to keep this private, but I can't watch men pursue you and do nothing. I can't maintain this facade when every instinct is screaming to claim you publicly. Elena stared at him, something flickering in her expression. You want to go public? With us? Yes. That means people will talk. They'll say I slept my way into my position, that I'm using you for money, that I don't care what they say, Alessandro interrupted. I care about you. About us. About not having to hide the best thing that's ever happened to me. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the moonlight. Then she stepped closer, her hand coming up to his cheek. Okay, she said softly. Okay, if you're ready to deal with the fallout, then yes. I'm tired of hiding too. Tired of pretending that when you look at me in the office my heart doesn't race. Tired of maintaining distance when all I want is to be close to you. Alessandro pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, breathing in the lavender scent that had haunted him since that first day in the cafe. You're sure? I'm sure, she confirmed, though we should probably go back inside before people assume we're doing something inappropriate on the terrace. He laughed. The tension breaking. Would that be so terrible? Yes. Because I have standards, she said primly, but her eyes were sparkling. If we're going to scandalize the company, let's do it properly. They returned to the gala together, Alessandro's hand firmly at the small of her back, making no effort to hide the possessive gesture. The whispers started immediately. Alessandro ignored them, keeping Elena close as he made his rounds, introducing her not as his secretary, but as Elena, letting the intimacy speak for itself. It was near midnight when they finally left, Alessandro's driver taking them back to Elena's apartment because it had become their default refuge. In the car, Elena laughed suddenly. What? Alessandro asked. I was just thinking about my first day at your office. If someone had told me then that within 6 months I'd be falling in love with my terrifying billionaire boss, I would have thought they were insane. Alessandro's heart stopped. What did you say? She froze, realizing what had slipped out. I didn't mean to say that. It just... Say it again, he demanded softly. Tell me again. Alessandro, please. She took a breath, met his eyes. I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I already have fallen. Completely, terrifyingly, irrevocably in love with you. Alessandro cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. Elena Martinez, I fell in love with you the moment you collapsed in my office and I realized losing you was unthinkable. No. Before that. The first time you looked at me without fear. The first time you challenged me. The first time I saw your strength. I've been falling this entire time, and Cristo, it terrifies me too. But I've never been more certain of anything. He kissed her then, deep and claiming, pouring everything he felt into it. When they finally broke apart, Elena was crying. Happy tears. She assured him at his concerned look. Just happy tears because this is real, and you love me, and I love you, and I still can't quite believe this is my life. Believe it, Alessandro said firmly, because I'm not letting you go. Ever. They spent that night tangled together in her bed, whispering promises and dreams and fears. Alessandro told her he wanted to meet her family, properly, as her partner. Elena admitted she wanted to finish her nursing degree, that maybe with financial stability she could pursue that dream again. They talked about the future in a way that assumed they'd be facing it together, and it felt right. Natural. Inevitable. The next week, Alessandro made it official. A company-wide email went out announcing that Miss Elena Martinez had been promoted to Chief of Staff, a new position that came with significant responsibility and compensation commensurate with her value to the company. It also included a carefully worded disclosure that they were in a personal relationship, approved by the board and HR, with all appropriate ethical guidelines in place. The gossip was intense, but brief. It helped that Elena was genuinely brilliant at her new role, that the promotion was clearly deserved, that Alessandro's business results only improved with her at his side. It helped more that Alessandro made it clear in a dozen small ways that anyone who disrespected Elena would answer to him personally. 2 months later, Alessandro took Elena to meet his estranged father, Antonio Vittorio, the man who'd raised him with impossible standards and conditional love. It did not go well. You're dating your secretary? Antonio said, with obvious disdain. How cliché. I'm in love with an extraordinary woman, Alessandro corrected coldly. Her previous job title is irrelevant. She's after your money, obviously. Elena, who'd stayed quiet during most of the disastrous dinner, finally spoke up. Mr. Vittorio, I had a job, and an apartment, and a life before I met your son. I don't need his money. I'm with him because he's brilliant and kind and actually capable of love, which seems to be something you never taught him. Antonio's face purpled. How dare you know? How dare you, Alessandro interrupted, standing. How dare you assume that the only reason someone could love me is for money? How dare you try to poison this the way you poisoned everything else in my life? He took Elena's hand, pulling her to her feet. We're leaving. And father, don't contact me again unless you can treat the woman I love with respect. They left Antonio sputtering, and in the car, Elena turned to Alessandro with wide eyes. That was intense. He's toxic, Alessandro said flatly. Always has been. I should have cut him off years ago. He's still your father. Biology doesn't make family, Alessandro said. Love does. Respect does. Choice does. My father has never respected me, never loved me unconditionally. You have, so if I have to choose, I choose you. Every time. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Alessandro Vittorio, you're going to make me cry in this nice car. Then cry, he said gently. I'll always have tissues. She laughed through her tears and kissed him, and Alessandro knew he'd made the right choice. Some bridges needed to burn. A week later, they flew to Puerto Rico to meet Elena's family. Unlike the disaster with Antonio, this went beautifully. Maria Martinez welcomed Alessandro with the same warmth she'd shown during that first lunch, and Roberto, while protective, could see how his daughter glowed when Alessandro was near. You're good for her, Roberto told Alessandro privately while Maria was showing Elena old photo albums. She's good for me, Alessandro replied. She saved me, actually, from becoming like my father. From building an empire but forgetting to build a life. Roberto nodded slowly. Then you have my blessing. But hurt her, and money won't protect you. If I hurt her, I'll deserve whatever you do to me, Alessandro said honestly. But I won't. She's everything to me. They stayed for a long weekend and Alessandro experienced something he'd never had. Real family. Warmth, unconditional acceptance, love that didn't come with strings or expectations. He understood why Elena's strength had such depth. She'd been built by people who truly loved her. On the flight back to New York, Elena fell asleep on his shoulder, and Alessandro sat there thinking about the future. About the ring he'd already commissioned, a custom design that incorporated elements meaningful to both of them. About the proposal he was planning, nothing public or showy, just the two of them, and a moment of perfect honesty. About the life they were building together, piece by piece, day by day. He'd built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, an empire that spanned continents, accumulated wealth beyond measure, but none of it mattered as much as the woman sleeping trustingly against him. The woman who'd seen past his money and masks to the man underneath, who'd chosen to love him anyway. 3 months later, on the anniversary of the day she'd collapsed in his office, Alessandro proposed. Not at a fancy restaurant or public venue, but in her apartment with Mochi as their witness. Elena said yes before he'd finished asking, and they sat on her couch crying and laughing simultaneously, planning a future that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a collapse and a crisis. Sometimes they're built by two people who were willing to be vulnerable, to let their carefully constructed walls crumble, to choose each other over fear. Alessandro and Deborah didn't find perfect love, but they found real love. The kind that sees all your scars and loves you anyway. The kind that chooses to stay when things get hard. The kind that proves being truly seen is the greatest gift anyone can give. And maybe this story speaks to all of us, that we deserve to be loved for who we truly are. That real connection is worth more than any empire. That sometimes the best things in life come when we're brave enough to be vulnerable, to let someone in, to build something more enduring than skyscrapers. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing narratives that move hearts.